Chapter 1. To the Guillotine. My grandfather loves telling me stories. He is passionate about history, and I am a big fan of legends and adventures too. I never get tired of listening to them. So, one evening, around Christmas time, I sat down with Grandpa and asked him all about the French Revolution. He told me one of the most mysterious stories I had ever heard, taking me back through time to revolutionary France. "Make yourself comfortable now," he said. "I'm going to tell you a story I read when I was a boy. It was so thrilling. I can still remember every detail."
"Have I heard it before, Grandpa?"
I asked. "Well, let's see now. It's called The Scarlet Pimpernel. Does that mean anything to you?"
"I've never heard of it,"
I replied. "That's what I thought. Listen carefully now. Our story begins in Paris in the 18th century, during the French Revolution."
"I remember,"
I interrupted.
"Our history teacher told us all about the guillotine and how the aristocrats had their heads cut off."
"As I was saying," Grandpa continued, "in 1789 the French people took back power from the monarchy. The corrupt French kings and queens were rich, but the ordinary people didn't even have enough to eat. They wanted revenge. Counts and countesses, dukes and duchesses, barons and baronesses, and even the king and queen went to the guillotine." By now I was curious.
"That sounds really violent. Didn't the aristocrats try to escape?"
"Well, some of them certainly tried their best," Grandpa explained. "Every afternoon, just before the gates of Paris closed, aristocrats tried to escape. They left the city in disguise. Men dressed as women, women as men, children as beggars."
"But weren't there any soldiers on duty? Didn't they check people going through the gates?"
"Oh, yes, and the citizen soldiers caught the aristocrats almost every time. But some were clever enough to escape the Committee of Public Safety and go to England, where they started a new life. This is where the Scarlet Pimpernel comes in, and here's where our story really begins." "One particular soldier, Sergeant Bibot," Grandpa began, "could find an aristocrat in any disguise. He played with his prey like a cat plays with a mouse. He let the aristocrats through the gates and, just when they thought they were free, ordered his guards to capture them. No one could escape him, and no man could be happier in his job. But for some time now, Bibot had heard strange rumors about disappearing aristocrats. He was furious. How could they possibly get through the net? People said that a courageous band of Englishmen organized the escapes, and their leader was clever and terribly audacious. At the scene of every escape, the mysterious Englishman always left a sign. A note with a small, star-shaped flower drawn on it. The Scarlet Pimpernel. Of course, the members of the committee were angry and embarrassed at the news. They decided to offer a large sum of money for the capture of the elusive Scarlet Pimpernel. Dear old Sergeant Bibot thought he was cleverer than anyone else. He was hoping to catch such a valuable prey. He wanted to succeed where everyone else had failed. Secretly, he dreamt of being as famous as the Scarlet Pimpernel. Chapter 2. Signed, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Every time a cart stopped at the gates, Bibot searched it from top to bottom. He didn't want to end his life like Citizen Gropier. His stupidity cost him his head.
What happened to Gropier then? I asked Grandpa.
Gropier was a sergeant too. His job was to guard the city gates, like Bibot, and make sure that no aristocrats got through. One afternoon, a cart filled with barrels stopped at his post. An old man was driving it, and a boy was sitting next to him. Naturally, Gropier checked every one of the barrels very carefully. He soon realized they were empty, and he let the cart through the gates.
So what happened next?
You'll see. Half an hour later, a captain of the guard and a dozen of his men ran up to the gates. "Did a cart go through here?" the captain asked Gropier anxiously. "Why, yes," Gropier replied. "I let one through half an hour ago." "Imbecile!" cried the captain furiously. "You'll pay for your mistake with your head. The Duc de Chaly and his entire family were hiding in that old cart, and the Scarlet Pimpernel was driving it."
What an idiot Gropier was! I exclaimed.
Not so fast now. Here's what happened next. The captain ordered Gropier and his men to go after the cart immediately. "If you catch them, the money will be yours," he shouted. Sergeant Gropier and his soldiers ran through the gate and disappeared in a flash.
"But it was too late."
"This time you're wrong," laughed Grandpa. "The aristocrats weren't hiding in the barrels, and the driver wasn't the Scarlet Pimpernel. The captain was that damned Englishman in disguise, and every one of his soldiers was an aristocrat."
Incredible!
"Incredible, but true," Grandpa said. After that, Bibot was determined not to be tricked in the same way. Then, one afternoon, an ugly old woman stopped her cart at Bibot's post. "My grandson's ill," she said, pointing to the inside of the cart. "Some say he's got the plague." When they heard these words, Bibot and his men instinctively moved back. "You're a coward, citizen," she laughed. "The plague? God bless you!" Bibot shouted in reply. The terrible disease horrified him. The old woman didn't waste any time. She drove out through the gates like lightning. Suddenly, a captain ran up to the gates, just like the one in Gropier's story. Bibot knew he wasn't the Scarlet Pimpernel, because he knew the captain well. "A cart?" he shouted breathlessly. "Have you seen a cart?" "What cart?" asked Bibot. "A cart driven by an ugly old woman and her grandson, a child with the plague." Yes," replied Bibot, who was white with fear. "And you let them through?" "That cart was carrying the Countess de Tournay and her 2 children, all of them traitors and condemned to death. And the driver," continued the captain, "was surely the Scarlet Pimpernel." "Help," murmured Bibot, his face pale. "This time the guillotine's for me." Chapter 3. Margot. I was curious to hear the next part of the story.
"So, tell me, Grandpa, where did all the aristocrats go when they'd escaped?"
Well, they all found safety in England, where the Scarlet Pimpernel had a secret hiding place. Once they'd crossed the English Channel, they met in the port of Dover at an inn called the Fisherman's Rest.
"And the Countess de Tournay and her 2 children were hiding there too?"
That's right. the family were celebrating their escape from the horrors of the guillotine and enjoying a meal with their English hosts. They were toasting His Majesty the King with the Scarlet Pimpernel's men.
Wasn't the Scarlet Pimpernel there too?
I wanted to know. No, he always worked in secret. No one knew his identity except his band of men, and they never told anyone who he was. Back at the inn, the Countess de Tournay was still eating her meal when someone announced that Margot Saint-Just and her husband, Sir Percy Blakeney, had just arrived.
Who were they?
I interrupted. Give me a minute and I'll explain. Margot Saint-Just was once a famous French actress. Then she married Sir Percy, the richest man in England. Now she was Lady Blakeney, the most fashionable woman in London. Lady Blakeney is the last person I want to see, exclaimed the Countess de Tournay angrily. She denounced the Marquis de Saint-Cyr and his whole family to the Committee for Public Safety, and her brother, Armand Saint-Just, is a Republican. At that very moment, Lady Blakeney and Sir Percy walked into the room. Lady Blakeney's great beauty and gentle voice made everyone pause instinctively.
But why didn't the Countess de Tournay want to meet Lady Blakeney? Because she'd denounced those aristocrats to the committee?
At the time, Grandpa went on, all aristocrats were united. They all hated the revolutionaries because they had taken away their power.
So what happened next?
Well, the Countess decided to go up to her room to avoid Lady Blakeney and Sir Percy.
What's he got to do with the Scarlet Pimpernel?
I interrupted again. Stop interrupting, and I'll tell you. We've got the whole evening for our story. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, Sir Percy was quite a handsome man, and he was always dressed at the height of fashion. But he was rather expressionless, and he had a childish laugh. People thought he was boring, quite the opposite from his clever, brilliant wife, Margot, an actress with the Comédie Française. Of course, everyone was surprised when they married. Had the most beautiful woman in Europe married an idiot just for his money? But back to our story. Sir Percy had a boat called the Daydream. That evening, Marguerite's brother, Armand Saint-Just, was going to sail it across the Channel to France. Margot was very close to her brother, and she decided to go and say goodbye to him. Down by the port, Margot waited. She looked terribly sad. "Don't go, Armand. I'll be all alone without you," she said with tears in her eyes. "But my dearest Margot, Percy loves you," her brother replied. "He loved me once, but not any more. Not since people said that I denounced the Marquis de Saint-Cyr to the committee." An hour later, Margot watched as the Daydream left the port. It was taking her brother, the only person she trusted, to an uncertain destiny. Chapter 4. A Trap.
Tell me more about the Marquis de Saint-Cyr, Grandpa.
It's quite simple. Armand, Margot's brother, fell in love with the Marquis's daughter, Angèle. But the Saint-Just family weren't aristocrats, and the Marquis refused to let Armand marry Angèle. Terrible, isn't it? Naturally, Margot hated Saint-Cyr, but she didn't denounce him to the committee. One day, Margot was talking to her revolutionary friends about the terrible Marquis. He was in secret contact with one of France's great enemies, Austria. After this, Margot's friends reported him to the committee. The entire Saint-Cyr family was guillotined because of her foolish words. But now, back to our story. A few days after Margot watched it leave, the Daydream was travelling back to Dover with a message from Armand. "My dearest sister, I promise to be careful." The news reached Margot, who had returned to her home in London. She was relieved to hear from Armand. She felt relaxed enough to go to the opera that evening, and she sat happily in her box at the theatre, listening to an opera by Gluck. During the third act, someone knocked quietly at the door. "Come in," Margot said, without turning around to see who was there. "Citizen, I must speak to you," said a voice. Margot looked round. Her mysterious visitor was standing in a dark corner of the box, so no one in the audience could see him. But wait, Margot knew him. It was Chauvelin, a spy for the committee. "What are you doing in London, dear friend? You serve France, not England," Margot exclaimed. "I wanted to talk to you in private, so I waited until you were alone. We don't have much time, citizen, so listen carefully. Your brother is in danger." "I don't believe you. This is all a plan to frighten me. What do you want, Chauvelin?" "We need your help, citizen. France needs you to find the Scarlet Pimpernel." "I'm not interested in him." "And what about your brother, Margot? My spies have found a letter from him to the Scarlet Pimpernel." "Well?" Margot exclaimed. "Well, dear Margot, your brother is a member of the League of the Scarlet Pimpernel." "That's ridiculous. Armand hates aristocrats. He'll never help them as long as he lives." "You're wrong, citizen. Armand is working with the Scarlet Pimpernel, and I have a letter to prove it." Chauvelin smiled. "What do you want from me?" Margot asked angrily. "If you help me to find the Scarlet Pimpernel, France's most hated enemy, your brother's life will be saved."
"Did she agree, Grandpa?"
I asked anxiously. Did she have any choice? Margot knew what she had to do. "If I don't help Chauvelin find the Scarlet Pimpernel, Armand will go to the guillotine," she cried. Chapter 5. Lord Grenville's Ball. I was still curious. But what did Margot really think about the Scarlet Pimpernel? Well, she was certainly fascinated by him, and just think, a clever, beautiful woman like Margot married to an idiot like Sir Percy. Now, the Scarlet Pimpernel was truly inspirational. He was strong, courageous, and charming. He had a band of loyal men who followed him blindly, and his secret identity made him seem even more gallant. "If I meet him, I'm sure I won't be able to resist his charms," Margot thought to herself. And she thought that her husband didn't love her any more. But how did she plan to find the Scarlet Pimpernel? I asked. "Here's what happened next," Grandpa went on. Chauvelin had told her to go to the ball at Lord Grenville's home that evening. Chauvelin's spies had given him some information about the Scarlet Pimpernel. The damned Englishman, as he called him, had arranged to meet 2 of his men there. "You must be careful tonight, citizen," Chauvelin said to Margot. "Keep your eyes on Sir Andrew Ffoulkes and Lord Anthony Dewhurst. We've just discovered that they're members of the League. They're meeting their leader, that damned Englishman, to plan an escape for the Countess de Tournay's husband. I believe you and the Countess are close friends, citizen." "Enough of your jokes, Chauvelin," Margot replied angrily. "Please be as quick as possible." "There's nothing more to say. I'll see you at the ball."
What will happen if I don't help you? Margot inquired.
It will be truly terrible for Armand, citizen, Chauvelin replied, menacingly.
If I help you, will you give me back my brother's letter to the Scarlet Pimpernel?
Why, of course you can have it back, Chauvelin replied, an evil smile on his face. I promise.
Why did Chauvelin hate the Scarlet Pimpernel so much? I asked Grandpa.
It's simple. He hated him because he'd used money and his incredible courage to free French aristocrats. Chauvelin had made a promise to his colleagues at the committee. I'll bring the Scarlet Pimpernel to you. His dream was to send the damned Englishman to the guillotine. So, you see, Grandpa went on, Margot had no choice. She had to go to Lord Grenville's ball with her husband. Later that evening, Margot looked around at Lord Grenville's guests, trying to imagine who the famous hero was. Suddenly, she saw her husband's friend, Lord Hastings, pass a note to Sir Andrew Ffoulkes. Margot decided to follow him. She had to find out what the note said. She was convinced that it contained a clue to the Scarlet Pimpernel's identity and a promise of safety for her brother.
But before she could read the note, she had to get it from Sir Andrew, I interrupted.
That's right. But don't forget, Margot was a very clever woman. She walked slowly towards Sir Andrew and pretended to faint. Sir Andrew was a true gentleman. He put out his arms to catch her. Just as Margot had planned, he dropped the note.
Better to drop the note than Lady Blakeney, I laughed.
Quite right. Margot made sure that no one could see her. Then she picked up the note and hid it in her hand. Sir Andrew carried her to a sofa, then went into another room to get help. Margot quickly took her chance. She read the note. As she finished reading, Margot's eyes fell on a small red flower.
I must leave for France tomorrow. If you still want to speak to me, I'll be in the dining room at the time we arranged, 1 o'clock.